So, what a concept. Let's learn some concepts. We're going to talk about what concepts are, then we're going to talk about various views of concepts and debate them, and then we're going to talk about applying concepts specifically within the context of something called conceptual innateness, which basically just means that humans might be born with a certain way of viewing the world. We have some innate concepts. So it's going to go back to the blank slate discussion from really modernity, like centuries ago. Things to remember here are the mental representation discussion. Mental representations were also referenced in the perception lecture, so hopefully you've seen these two videos back to back. The basic idea is some mental states might stand for some other phenomenon in the outside world. Perception, of course, being the previous video, how we come to be aware of the outside world. And then here, I want you to recall the innateness of language discussion from way back in the day when we were arguing against behaviorism. This was essentially an argument that if anything is innate, language has to be innate because there's so many different ways of learning things. You know, there's so many different ways of structuring possible sentences that we must be able to have some sort of innate grammar, so to speak. Okay. So why should we think about concepts? You remember the discussion about representations? I pointed out that there was this idea of mental content. There was the external world, which the entire previous lecture was about how you perceive that. And you represent the world in some way. But we don't usually, we don't always look at objects in themselves. We don't always look at just like individual light or sound, like basic sensory qualities. Sometimes we group our experience in certain ways. And we base our understanding of reality on those groups. We make rules, we decide based on them. It would be really, really hard to judge every single thing as a purely unique instance of something. So our minds do this naturally, and at the end of this lecture, we'll talk about whether it's innate, but it's interesting that we do it. We don't think about everything as separate. We think about chairs. A single chair is an instance of a chair. So I want to make some very brief distinctions. They're not going to be that essential, and if you mess these up, it's going to be okay. But the basic idea is that concepts are kind of a mental representation. Categories are going to be something abstract outside of your mind, right? They're whatever you pick out. So one of them is in your head, and the other one is some grouping in the world. We say that things belong in the same category if they're classified as being the same thing in some particular way. So you show up to class and you don't have to study each and every separate four-legged object, and you just think about them all as chairs and tables, right? You go and meet people and you don't have to like individually assess each one. You think, oh no, you are a human being. Right? Same with dogs and cats. Because if you didn't do that, if you didn't have categories, if you didn't make concepts in your mind, it would just take forever to do everything. It'd be very inefficient. And we would probably not get anything done. But notice that all groupings are going to leave out some information. They're going to include some things and leave out some things. So we do this for all sorts of things, whether it's, quote, natural kinds or artifacts that we create, so natural kinds being maybe diamonds or gold or plants or animals, life, that kind of thing. Things that we create, hammers, chairs, and cups. We can have concepts that are abstract ideas that we create, in our society, like felony, contract, majority. Verbs, activities, noun combinations, whether they're brand new, such as apple chair or carpet light or ear filter. Your mind made a thing about them. You thought about it. You went, oh, that's a weird. I've never seen those combinations before. Or whether you've seen them before, like phone, book, dog, bed, candy, cigarette. Names, social roles, abstract nouns, adjectives, even technical terms, right? So there's so many different ways of grouping. We do this all the time, all the time. Every day you do this. And you can even perceive things as belonging to categories. We don't think about whether somebody is 12% bald or 82% bald. We think about them as bald, not bald, or balding or something like that, right? We sometimes it's ambiguous, but usually we cluster people in a particular group. We force things that we encounter to be into particular categories. Sometimes this is bad, right? We do that with stereotypes. You make pretty gross generalizations about entire peoples based on limited experience. Sometimes it's good. It saves us time. We know what brands we like. We know what stores we like to go to, what kinds of things we enjoy doing for fun. And all the while we debate these back and forth. Categories are probably the thing that we spent most time debating and talking about, whether something belongs in it or not. We'll get more into that later on in the video. So you might think about categories roughly on a continuum. At one extreme, there are things that we might call natural kinds or classical kinds. So this would be something like periodic elements in the periodic table. These are things that are defined based on a single entity, a single object, a single thing, but they are nevertheless, most people would group them in that particular way. Then there's property kinds, right? Entities that share lots of properties. We might call them property clusters. Like most things that have feathers and beaks and talons and wings, we call birds. Those are properties that we group as birds. Now I could make something out of paper mache and attach a bunch of feathers to it, and you'd be like, okay, that has a lot of the properties of birds, but it is not a bird. That's fine. It turns out that property kinds aren't as clear as classical kinds. Conventional kinds, these are things that our society groups together, but a different society might not group, right? So games, you go to the games section of Target or whatever, and you will see card games, and you will see party games, and you might see hoop and stick. And in other societies, people would group different things in those in that section of their store, right? So we're getting more and more arbitrary as we go down here. Classical kinds, you would imagine an alien coming down to Earth. They would have categories for gold, and you would show them gold, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, we call it something else, but that is gold." And then you would describe birds, and they would be able to very quickly intuit what kind of an entity it is. For conventional kinds, you would basically have to teach them the entire culture for them to learn why games belong together. And then arbitrary groupings. Arbitrary groupings, I think, have nothing in common, and neither us nor aliens would lump them together, like ships and shoes and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. The only reason we group these is because Lewis Carroll, in a book 100 and change years ago, put them in a poem. Okay? So you can think about categories as more or less requiring of culture or particular circumstances. So the classical view of concepts was that you could give necessary conditions for concepts. That is, anything that had to have whatever the condition you illustrated, right? So all gold is metal, all gold is an element, all gold has 79 atoms. And they would be sufficient as well. So if you had something that had 79 atoms and metal and was an element, it would be gold. That's it. Aristotle thought this way. He divided the world into entities that had essential and accidental properties. And the essential properties were the ones that fit this classical concept, and anything accidental was like if you painted a gold coin blue, that wasn't essential to the goldness of the coin. We tend to think essentially. We tend to think categorically, and we think of our categories as being very rigid. So we tend to group concepts that way. But it turns out that it's actually really, really hard to live this way. If you try to figure out what are the necessary and sufficient criteria for any of the categories that you have, or many of them anyway, you'll find that it's really, really hard. What is a dessert? Like, oh, it's a sweet thing you have after dinner. Well, could you have dessert before dinner? Well, sure. Could you have dessert that's savory? Well, maybe. What is a bachelor? It's an unmarried male. Well, is the Pope a bachelor? No. Is a dog a bachelor? No. Is a child a bachelor? No. You have to come up with more and more ways of figuring out what the category is. Maybe squares in Euclidean geometry are defined as parallelograms with one right angle. Okay. But you've already made a lot of assumptions there, and yeah. So classical concepts are fairly rare. They don't exist all the time, and when we try to interrogate the way we talk about concepts, we don't find this to be a useful way of thinking about it. There's another phenomenon that we think of some items as more typical than others in a concept, but that's pretty weird. If it's necessary and sufficient, everything fits. That fits is as essential, as typical as everything else. So if we think about things as less typical, then less or more typical, then we should probably start moving away from the classical view, even though it's going to end up with being a less efficient system that might be ineffective in how we reason about the world. One way of moving away from this was proposed by a philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who argued for a family resemblance view of concepts. This was the idea that you cluster things on the basis of shared features and relations. So you and your parents and your siblings have different relations to each other, and you have similarities to each other, but they're not all the same similarity, and they're not all the same relation. It's a flexible way of thinking about categories. It seems to fit a lot of things that don't fit in the classical view. You can even imagine you and your sibling sharing features with your parents, but sharing no features whatsoever with each other. I mean, it's logically possible that you didn't inherit any of the same genes, or alleles, sorry, not genes. It's wildly improbable, but sure, like you could still be a sibling to somebody that you had no genetic relation to, in virtue of this family resemblance. It's a bit of a murky idea. I think it's helpful to move away from the classical view, but a lot of people thought that it needed to be spelled out a little bit more. And one way of spelling it out was thinking in terms of something that people started calling a prototype model. The idea of a prototype model takes this problem for the classical view and says, hey, what if we took that seriously? So in the classical view, if you recall, there were items that we thought that were more or less typical of a category. Well, what if we just said, okay, the most typical things are the things that define that concept, and anything that doesn't have enough of them doesn't belong. So take in, for example, this idea of a bird. There's a bunch of properties of birds. They lay eggs, they fly, they have wings, they have 2 legs, they have feathers. A super category of them is that they are animals. Subcategories are robins and pigeons, which are particular kinds of birds. So in the prototype model, anything that has eggs, flies, wings, 2 legs, or feathers, or enough of those, would be more likely to be grouped into the concept of bird. And if you looked up at night and you saw something flapping, you would probably think bird. But then if you looked closely and realized that it didn't lay eggs, didn't have feathers, you might think, oh, it was a bat, actually. So, all right, prototype model. Kind of cool thing about this is that a lot of properties, none of the properties have to be either necessary or sufficient, right? So birds fly and have wings, but so do planes. Birds lay eggs, have 2 legs and feathers, but so did velociraptors. Sorry about that. Raptors is the super category of velociraptors, sorry. So, okay. Moving away from the classical view, developing a family resemblance view in the form of a prototype view. Fair. What else can we do? There's another view called the exemplar view. And the exemplar view is kind of like the prototype view, except the difference is instead of taking abstract properties as being essential, you pick a single entity, like a real creature. So try to think of a bird. You probably thought of a robin instead of an emu or a penguin. Try to think of a dog. You might have thought of a Great Dane instead of a Xoloitzcuintli or I don't know, what's a less doggy dog? A Mastiff or something else, right? A husky. The idea is, in the exemplar view, is you pick a particular entity in the world, and anything that's similar enough to it gets to count as belonging to that concept. So you'll notice that both exemplar and prototype views are going to rely on some notion of similarity. But it's not just number of features, right? Like you might think that feathers and wings and I don't know, having 2 eyes and having flying in a V formation are all properties of birds, but you don't think that if birds didn't fly in V formations that they would stop being birds, right? So similarity is important, but it's not just number. You have some other aspect related to similarity that matters. There's a bunch of other views here that I'm not going to talk about that are fun to talk about, but you know, I won't. These are views of concepts that we might base them on knowledge, or there's many kinds, or we learn them based on a process rather than some abstract features of them. the two that are going to matter for us are prototype and exemplar. And so I'm going to end this video here and then discuss the last two sections of this lecture in another video.